worst case scenario is it just turns out to be a way for the state to hide prisoners in county jails. There'll be a lot more litigation. 10 years from now, we'll be back in court deciding that the jails have become the new prisons of mass incarceration. That would, I agree with you, that would be not good in any respect. But there's another possibility. Hidden in that law is also a considerable discretion for the counties to choose to not use incarceration at all if they think that the person can be kept in the community without too much risk. They've been given that discretion. And that's where the hope is, right? Because the counties have two things going for them. As I've already said, they have much more human capital, and that's you as well, right? Students, people getting training in various kinds of professions that can provide some of the social services that are needed, so that there's a lot more resources there. But they also have something else important. They have an incentive. Imagine that the way realignment is supposed to work, the county is going to get a block grant of money based on roughly the proportion of people they had in the prison system. Right. So in a sense, you could view that as, all right, you take them, you take the money. Now, if you lock them up, it's going to cost you almost that much money. Even though you can do it a little cheaper maybe, but it's still going to cost you almost all that money. But if you can find a way to take half of those people you're going to lock up and put them into some kind of meaningful work programs in the community, community service jobs, restorative justice projects, therapeutic justice projects, mental health courts. We could just go on and on with the various kinds of innovative ground level strategies that are out there that are much, much cheaper than jail. So if you do that, you can take all of that money you've saved and it doesn't go back to the state. You keep it right here in Alameda County. And people don't realize this, but counties are where we all live. It's actually where almost all the things that matter to us get decided in terms of social services, in terms of educational funding, etc. And it's a very responsive level of government. Ironically, people don't know who their representatives are, and they don't really do much to try to influence them, but you could. Whereas the only people that influence the California legislature are by and large the Prison Officers Union and other very well organized, basically law enforcement lobbies. When it comes to the Oakland City Council or the Alameda County Board of Supervisors, organizations that are grassroots, community-based organizations can have a much bigger influence. So I actually am a big fan of realignment. I think long-term it puts the incentives in and the kind of structural decision-making power in the right place. Now it's up to all of us to put the pressure on our local leaders to make sure it happens. And if any of you are from San Francisco, please read my blog, because I've endorsed somebody in the DA's race. And that's very, very important. DAs are going to make a lot of the decisions for who gets to jail and who gets alternative sentences.
Also, the Berkeley website and other places.
I was reading this article about how in Chicago they're considering basically for minor drug offenses instituting like a higher fine instead of incarceration. Is there anything like that happening in California? Because I feel like a lot of what people do incarceration for is drug offenses.
No, that's a great point. I mean, fines generally are the great missed opportunity in American penality. It's funny that for a country that thinks money is everything, we don't think money is a good punishment. And you could write a whole interesting history of that. But it's true. I mean, by far the most common penalty in Europe are fines, and they're used much more widely, not just for traffic offenses, but all kinds of offenses. Now, personally, I would move the whole drug regulation business out of the criminal justice system. But guess what? There are a lot of crimes that we ought to be much more aggressive enforcing. One of them is fraud. I mean, most of the stuff that happened in the great financial debacle that we're all now staggering out of is punishable as an old traditional crime called fraud. That's when you misrepresent something to somebody with the intention of getting them to rely on that misrepresentation to part with their money or their property. And that happened to millions of people who now have foreclosed homes, etc. So especially in the new economy where more of you are going to be out there selling some app or whatever, I don't know quite how it works, you tell me, it's going to be really important to know that you're not being defrauded and to punish people who are defrauding. And actually fines are a great way to do that, right? Because people don't defraud other people to get their rocks off. They do it to make money, right? So if you can take a lot of their money away, you can do a lot to deter them. And so I'm a big fan of fines. And again, you might think the biggest problem with them historically has been the idea that they're unfair, that Bill Gates can pay that fine really easily, Jonathan Simon, frankly, can pay that fine pretty easily, but maybe you would have to go get that. Do they still give temporary loans at Sproul Hall to cash loans so that you can pay that fine? Well, one way to handle that is what's called a day fine method. We just figure out whatever you earn a day. And we give you, you fine Jonathan Simon 400 days of his salary, or you fine you 400 days of your salary. And it adds up to a very painful fine for anybody, but it doesn't wipe you out if you're poor. I don't know that one in particular. I know Norway has generally a good reputation for prisons, but what did you observe about it?
I just heard it's one of the few prisons that doesn't have cells and it's on an island, and they're really big rehabilitation.
All over Europe, and especially in the Nordic countries, there are really good examples. And again, when I said at the beginning I was trying to be a bit provocative, I'm not an abolitionist. I mean, I do believe that prisons on a much smaller scale, hopefully very redesigned than they are now, would need to be a part of a humane, dignified, human rights-oriented legal system, because there simply is no other way to address truly serious crime, right? Where to have the person walking around would be a direct assault on the dignity of the victims and their families. There's truly no way to punish some crimes without prison, I think. And yet it doesn't need to be for the very long periods of time we do now, and it doesn't need to be, I would say that the actual task of prisons, you ought to be sent to prison as a punishment, but when you get to prison, the whole prison ought to be organized around maintaining your dignity, to prevent the degradation from happening, because we know that if you go to the website of the Stanford Prison Experiment, right? I didn't get a chance to talk about that, but we know that prisons are inherently challenges to the dignity of human beings. They move everybody toward a more degraded state. So you actually have to take positive efforts inside a prison to prevent that, and that can be done. There are ways of doing that, and unfortunately the U.S. is a long way from getting to the point of focusing on that problem, but when we do, actually there are good models out there, and Norway would be one of them.
Yeah, a lot of questions. Yes, 1, 2, 3, 4.
You want me to take a few, and then I'll...
Yeah, that's a good idea. Let's group them, and maybe you could then repeat them so people can hear it.
Sure.
I think it's better. All these are great questions. So why don't we just go in order? Everyone asks a question. Starting here, go around the room. Okay?
I was just wondering, what's the role correctional officer unions have in mass incarceration and the inhumanity in prisons?
Good question.
Okay, you'll repeat all this, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. Good.
What's the role of private prisons in California's realignment?
Good question.
Why doesn't the Prison Wage Elimination Act apply in ICE detention centers?
The short answer is I don't know. That's a very good question. I can research it.
My understanding of the ruling that happened in May was that all it did was realignment, but it sounded like you were talking about some things in mental health or something. That's all learned what else.
Okay.
The Prison Litigation Reform Act of 1996. I was thinking about the broad intervener rights that allowed people like Chile or Ohio and Arizona to claim protecting public citizens to something.
Right.
Could I add a last
Yeah.
question to this? Just, you quoted Justice Breyer saying that you have a real human rights problem here, and you said earlier that American discussions usually have to do with cruel and unusual punishment and not human rights. Now, and
Right.
of course, we've had many instances in which America was reluctant to speak in human rights language or to accept it. We talked about the reluctance to remember the Genocide Convention, to join the European Court, and the general history of not liking broad international jurisdictions and preferring these narrow ones. Can you say maybe a little
Yeah.
bit about the significance you think of using human rights language rather than cruel and unusual punishment language?
Yeah, that's a great question. All right, so let me just see if I can get these roughly right. So first question was about the role of the Prison Officers Union, the California, the California Correctional Peace Officers Association, I think, CCPOA. First of all, let me recommend, and I blurbed it, an excellent book by a Berkeley graduate, Josh Page, got his PhD in sociology here, now teaches at Minnesota, called The Toughest Beat. And it is a fantastic sort of sociological history of the union, its rise, how it shaped this. I can just give you a flavor of it. Basically, the union in California is fairly unique, and I think, and clearly one of the reasons we have such an extreme version of mass incarceration. They got organized as a union in the early 70s, and that's very important because that was kind of, I would argue, the moment when this new cultural common sense of fear of crime and what I called in my book, Governing Through Crime, a kind of we the victims sensibility about who American citizens were was beginning to take shape. And the prison officers had a very visionary leader. They were very lucky from that point of view, who understood that the future for prison officers did not lie with other public unions like the nurses and the teachers, defining themselves as public employees and seeking traditional labor rights, but instead to view themselves as representatives of the state's victim class. And the way they did that was to basically say, look, because we're constantly being victimized by prisoners on the inside, and remember, the early 70s is also the high watermark of convict radicalism. You have George Jackson. You really do actually have quite a few murders of guards for the first time in California prison history. In that few short years between, say, 68 and 72, maybe a couple hundred guards were killed, which is a very large number, many more than the rest of the history combined before or after. So there is this sense that we're under assault by these radicalized prisoners. We're just like ordinary Californians, and we're just like police officers, but in our case, quote, we walk the toughest beat in the state. So they understood them. They had the vision to understand themselves as sort of representing, reflecting, and leading this kind of civil movement of citizens demanding a more penal state, basically. And now, of course, they also gained from that tremendously financially, and as a result of their tremendous influence on California legislature and governors, you all should be correctional officers. I mean, you don't even need a degree from Cal. You don't even need a college degree. You can get over $100,000 a year, and I think they have openings. So don't walk, run, right? You don't even need to graduate. Go! My point being that they did tremendously well on that. Now, what's interesting is your point about the humanity of prisoners. I think you're exactly right that one of the things that happened is that at that moment, they not only defined themselves as aligned with the larger public sentiment of victimization, they viewed convicts as all George Jacksons, right? All these kind of revolutionary threats to them. And they viewed themselves as essentially in a civil war-like footing against this armed guerrilla force. And as you can imagine, as we've seen in the War on Terror, that kind of narrative does not lend itself to, respecting people's humanity, right? It's an inherently degrading game when you imagine that you're in that kind of a game. And so they have viewed themselves in a zero-sum game with prisoners, where anything that improves prisoners, by definition, must be bad for guards, right? That kind of mindset. Now, the good news is, I think the current leadership of the union sees that they're trying to look over the horizon too. They see that the age of endlessly growing prisons is over in California. They also see that the conditions are so degrading now in California prisons that it's not fun to work in those places, even for $100,000 a year. So they're, I think, trying to find a way to be a more positive force. They join the prisoners in many of the features of the lawsuit, including the three-judge court. The second question was about private prisons and what role they might play under realignment. Well, the key thing to know is that they've played almost no role in California up till now, partly because of the powerful union. My view is that their role now would be largely a negative role if they came in, because they would be a way for the state to keep incarcerating people but at a less cost, and therefore delay the day of reckoning when we actually have to deal with whether we can afford all this incarceration. If you care about dignity, I think you should profoundly question having private prisons. The Israeli Supreme Court, in a very interesting and quite dramatic decision a year and a half ago, struck down a first